The house smelled like every memory Emma had ever tried to forget. Not in a bad way exactly. Not in the way that makes you recoil or cover your nose with your sleeve. It was subtler than that, more insidious. It was the scent of time itself, of decades compressed into wood grain and plaster, of lives lived fully and then abandoned to silence. Mothballs and lemon furniture polish, old paper and older dust, the particular mustiness that clings to places where windows haven't been opened in months, where air grows thick and still like water in a forgotten well. Emma stood in the foyer of her grandfather's house, her hand still resting on the doorknob, and felt the weight of it all pressing against her chest. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the funeral, since she'd stood in the rain watching them lower Samuel Hartley into the ground, since she'd made eye contact with her mother across the grave and seen nothing there but exhaustion and relief. 3 months since she'd promised herself she'd deal with this. 3 months of avoidance and excuse-making and letting the estate lawyer's emails pile up in her inbox like accusations. But now she was here. Finally. Unavoidably. The August heat outside had been oppressive, the kind of thick Virginia humidity that made breathing feel like work. But inside, the house was cool and dim, all the curtains drawn, all the windows sealed. It felt like stepping into a photograph, into a moment preserved and protected from the flow of time. Emma released the doorknob and took a step forward. Her sneakers made no sound on the Persian rug that stretched down the hallway. She'd played on this rug as a child, had traced its elaborate patterns with her small fingers while Grandpa Samuel worked in his study, the soft clicking of his typewriter forming a soundtrack to her childhood visits. The typewriter was probably still in there. Everything was probably still exactly where he'd left it. That was the problem. Emma dropped her backpack by the door and moved deeper into the house, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The living room opened to her left, furniture arranged exactly as it had been for 30 years. The same green sofa with the worn armrest where Grandpa Samuel always sat, the same brass floor lamp with the crooked shade, the same stack of National Geographic magazines on the coffee table, though the top issue now wore a layer of dust like a shroud. She'd expected this to be harder emotionally. She'd braced herself for waves of grief, for the sudden ambush of memory that would leave her sobbing in the hallway. But what she felt instead was something closer to claustrophobia, a pressing awareness of too much stuff, too many things, too many decisions waiting to be made. Every object in this house represented a choice. Keep, donate, trash. Every book on every shelf, every dish in every cabinet, every piece of clothing in every closet. How did one person accumulate so much in the single lifetime? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, already knowing who it would be. "Are you there yet?" Her mother's voice came through crisp and efficient. No preamble, no warmth. "Just walked in." "And?" Emma looked around the foyer, at the coat rack still holding her grandfather's windbreaker, at the umbrella stand, at the small table where he'd always left his keys. "It's a lot, Mom. It's going to take weeks to sort through all this." A sigh on the other end. "I told you we should hire someone. There are companies that do estate cleanouts. They come in, take everything, sort it, sell what's valuable, dispose of the rest. 2 days, maybe 3, and it's done. You want to have strangers rifle through Grandpa's entire life? I want to not spend the rest of the summer arguing about what to do with 40 years of accumulated junk." Her mother's voice had that edge to it now, the one that meant the conversation was about to veer into dangerous territory. Emma felt her jaw tighten. They'd had versions of this conversation a dozen times since the funeral. Her mother wanted efficiency, wanted closure, wanted to put the house on the market and be done with it all. Emma wanted to say goodbye properly, to understand the man her grandfather had been. I'll call you in a few days. Let you know how it's going. Emma, I have to go, Mom. I want to get started before it gets dark. She ended the call before her mother could protest and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The silence of the house settled around her again, heavier now. She stood there for a long moment, just breathing, just being present in the space her grandfather had occupied for most of his adult life. Samuel Hartley had been a history professor at the university, had taught there for 37 years before retiring. Emma remembered him as a tall man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, always with a book in his hand or a story on his lips. He'd lived alone after Grandma Rose died, had seemed content in his solitude and his routines. Mondays were for the library, Wednesdays for his writing group, Fridays for the coffee shop on Main Street, where he'd sit for hours with his notebook and his thoughts. He'd never remarried, never even dated as far as Emma knew. He'd simply folded himself into his work and his hobbies and the quiet architecture of his days. Had he been lonely? Had he been happy? Emma realized she didn't know. Wasn't sure she'd ever asked. She moved through the house slowly, room by room, taking inventory. The kitchen was frozen in time, 1970s appliances, linoleum floors, cabinets filled with mismatched dishes and cups. The bathroom still had his toothbrush in the holder, his reading glasses on the counter. His bedroom was neat, the bed made with military precision, books stacked on the nightstand in a precarious tower. Everything was exactly as he'd left it the morning he'd gone to the hospital and never come home. But it was the study that drew her. She'd been avoiding it, saving it for last, but now she found her feet carrying her down the hallway to the room at the back of the house. The door was closed. She put her hand on the knob and paused, feeling suddenly like an intruder, like she was about to violate some sacred space. Which was ridiculous. He was gone. He'd left everything to her. She had every right to be here. She opened the door. The study was exactly as she remembered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls, every inch of space crammed with volumes. The big oak desk is positioned in front of the window, though the curtains were drawn here too, filtering the afternoon light to a soft amber glow. His typewriter sat on the desk, an ancient IBM Selectric that probably belonged in a museum. Papers scattered across the surface, held down by a smooth river stone he'd used as a paperweight for as long as Emma could remember. She stepped inside and the door swung shut behind her with a soft click. The air in here was different, drier, preserved by the presence of so much paper. She ran her finger along the nearest bookshelf and it came away gray with dust. History books mostly. Biographies, collected letters, primary source documents. The Second World War seemed to be his particular obsession, shelf after shelf dedicated to that period. But there were other subjects too. The Civil War, the American Revolution, ancient Rome, medieval Europe. A lifetime of curiosity contained in this single room. Emma sat down in his desk chair, and it creaked under her weight. She picked up the stone paperweight, felt its coolness in her palm, its weight. She'd given this to him when she was 8 years old, had found it by the creek behind his house, and presented it to him like a treasure. He'd thanked her gravely, had told her it was the most beautiful stone he'd ever seen, and then he'd put it on his desk, and it had lived there ever since. 20 years. 20 years of holding down papers and gathering dust and being unremarkable. But he'd kept it. Of all the things he could have chosen to keep within reach, he'd chosen this. Something twisted in Emma's chest, sharp and unexpected. Grief, finally. The real thing. Not the performative sadness of the funeral or the abstract sense of loss she'd been carrying. This was personal and particular, and it hurt. She put the stone down carefully and picked up the top sheet of paper from the pile. It was a letter, handwritten in her grandfather's careful script. The date at the top was from 2 weeks before he died. Dear Emma. She left the study and walked back through the house to the kitchen. The basement door was there, just past the refrigerator, painted the same cream color as all the other doors in the house. She'd gone down there as a child a handful of times, had found it dark and spiderwebby and uninteresting, just boxes and old furniture and the smell of concrete and mildew. But now, with the letter fresh in her mind, she wondered what she'd missed. Emma pulled open the door and reached around the frame for the light switch. The stairs descended into darkness, steep and narrow. The light clicked on, a single bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs, casting long shadows. She took a breath and started down. The stairs creaked under her weight, announcing her descent. The air grew cooler with each step, that particular basement coolness that exists regardless of the season above. At the bottom, she reached up and pulled the chain on another bulb, then another, flooding the space with harsh yellow light. The basement was larger than she remembered. It stretched the full length of the house, low-ceilinged and divided by support columns into rough sections. And it was full, absolutely full. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling, old furniture pushed against walls, filing cabinets lined up like soldiers. The organization was haphazard at best, some boxes carefully labeled in her grandfather's handwriting, others sealed with tape and marked only with dates or question marks. Emma stood at the bottom of the stairs and felt her mother's words echo in her head. 40 years of accumulated junk. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe there was nothing here but the detritus of a life lived long and fully, the inevitable accumulation of stuff that happens when you stay in one place for decades and never bother to purge. But the letter, there's something I need to tell you about the basement. Emma moved forward, weaving between stacks of boxes, running her hands along their edges. Most were labeled with mundane descriptions. Tax records 1987 to 1993, Rose's teaching materials, books, duplicates for donation. Nothing remarkable, nothing that suggested hidden value or secret importance. She was about to give up, to head back upstairs and start with something easier, when she noticed it. At the very back of the basement, behind a wall of boxes and an old dresser with a broken drawer, there was a door. A small door, maybe 4 feet high, set into the concrete foundation of the house. Emma stopped breathing. She'd never seen this door before, had never even known it existed, but then she'd never ventured to this corner of the basement, had never had reason to explore the space thoroughly. She began moving boxes, pulling them away from the wall, creating a path. Some were heavy, packed tight with books or papers. Others were lighter, filled with clothes or linens. She worked quickly, her heart pounding now with something beyond curiosity, anticipation, maybe even excitement. It took 15 minutes to clear a path. By the end, she was sweating, despite the coolness of the basement, and dust coated her hands and clothes. But the door was accessible now, fully visible. It was painted the same cream color as the door at the top of the stairs, but the paint was older here, chipped and peeling in places. There was no handle, just a simple latch, the kind you'd find on a gate or a shed. Emma reached out and touched it, felt the cool metal under her fingertips. She lifted the latch. Before we continue with what Emma discovers, if you're enjoying the story of hidden legacies and family secrets, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories like this one. Now, let's see what Emma found behind that door. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing darkness beyond. Emma pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, shining it into the space. It wasn't a room. It was more like a large closet, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with boxes. But these boxes were different from the ones in the main basement. These were archival boxes, the kind museums and libraries used. Acid-free cardboard, carefully labeled, perfectly preserved. Emma stepped through the doorway, her phone light sweeping across the space. Her breath caught. Every box was labeled in her grandfather's handwriting, but the labels weren't mundane descriptions of household detritus. They were names, dates, places, historical events. Hiroshima, personal accounts, 1945 to 1946. Auschwitz, liberation, first-hand testimonies. D-Day landing, letters from Omaha Beach. Anne Frank, correspondence collection. Emma's hands were shaking. She reached for the nearest box and pulled it from the shelf. The weight of it was substantial. She set it on the floor and lifted the lid.
Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all carefully preserved in protective sleeves. She pulled out the first one and held her phone close to read it. The letter was dated August 7, 1945. It was written in faded ink on thin paper, the kind used during wartime rationing. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Dear Margaret, I don't know how to tell you what I saw yesterday. I don't know if I should tell you. But if I don't write it down, if I don't try to make sense of it somehow, I think I'll go mad. The letter went on, describing in devastating detail what the writer, a soldier named James, had witnessed in the aftermath of the atomic bomb. Emma read 3 sentences before she had to stop, her throat tight, her eyes burning. This was a primary source, a first-hand account of one of the most significant moments in human history. And it was in her grandfather's basement. Emma carefully returned the letter to its sleeve and replaced it in the box. Then she turned back to the shelves, her phone light moving from box to box, reading labels that made her head spin. Nuremberg trials, defense attorney's notes, Pearl Harbor, personal diaries, Battle of Stalingrad, survivor testimonies, Holocaust survivors, oral history transcripts. There had to be 50 boxes, maybe more, each one carefully cataloged, carefully preserved, each one filled with documents that scholars would give anything to access. How had her grandfather acquired all of this? How long had he been collecting it? And why had he kept it hidden down here, locked behind a wall of junk, accessible only through a door that looked like it led to a crawl space? Emma sat down on the cold concrete floor, her back against the shelves, her phone light pointing at the ceiling. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate, trying to understand. If even a fraction of these documents were authentic, if even a handful of these collections contained material that had never been published or cataloged by major institutions, her mother's voice echoed in her head again. There's no treasure hidden in that basement. Emma laughed, a short, sharp sound in the darkness. Laughed until the laughter turned to something else, something wet and overwhelming, until she was sitting in her grandfather's secret archive with tears running down her face and her hands pressed against her mouth. She'd thought she was here to clean out a house. She'd thought she was here to say goodbye. But she was beginning to realize she was here for something else entirely. To discover who her grandfather had really been. To uncover a legacy he'd spent a lifetime building in silence. And to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do with it all. Emma didn't sleep that night. She'd left the basement after sitting there for what felt like hours, her mind spinning through implications and possibilities until everything blurred together into white noise. She'd climbed the stairs on shaky legs, had locked the basement door behind her as if that small action could contain what she'd found, could keep it from spilling out and changing everything. Then she'd gone to the guest bedroom, her bedroom, she supposed, since she'd be staying here for the foreseeable future, and laid on top of the covers fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around her with its creaks and sighs. But sleep never came. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those labels, those names, those dates that had been burned into the collective consciousness of humanity. And she thought about the letters, the diaries, the testimonies contained in those boxes, stories from people who'd lived through moments that defined the 20th century, voices that might never have been heard, preserved by her grandfather in secret. Why in secret? That was the question that kept circling back, that wouldn't let her rest. If Samuel Hartley had spent decades collecting these materials, if he'd recognized their historical value, and he must have, given the care with which they were preserved, then why hide them? Why not donate them to a university archive?
Why not publish findings, write papers, share what he'd discovered with the academic community he'd been part of for almost 40 years? Instead, he'd built a wall of ordinary boxes around a hidden door and never told anyone what was behind it. Well, almost never. The unfinished letter suggested he'd been planning to tell her, "There's something I need to tell you about the basement." But whatever he'd meant to say, death had interrupted him, had left Emma alone with the discovery, and no instructions, no context, no explanation. Around 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and went back downstairs, made coffee in her grandfather's ancient percolator, finding grounds in the freezer that were probably months old but still serviceable. The ritual of it was soothing, measuring, pouring, waiting for the familiar burbling sound. She stood at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed and watched the sky outside the window, slowly lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray of early dawn. The house felt different now. It was still full of too much stuff, still overwhelming in its accumulation of a lifetime. But underneath that surface chaos, Emma now sensed something else: purpose, intention. Her grandfather hadn't just been a pack rat hoarding newspapers and broken appliances. He'd been a curator, a keeper of stories, a guardian of voices that might otherwise have been lost. She poured herself a cup of coffee, black, the way Grandfather Samuel had always taken it, and carried it back down to the basement. The stairs seemed less ominous now in the early morning light filtering through the small windows set high in the foundation walls. She flipped on the lights and made her way to the back corner, to the door she'd left unlatched. This time she came prepared. She'd found a camping lantern in the hall closet, and its bright LED light flooded the hidden archive with clinical clarity. She set it on the floor and began systematically examining the boxes, reading every label, trying to understand the scope of what her grandfather had collected. It was staggering. The boxes weren't just filled with letters and diaries. There were photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, personal effects that had been preserved, dog tags, medals, pieces of uniform, prayer books, wedding rings. There were newspaper clippings from publications that no longer existed, broadsides and propaganda posters, ration books and identity papers. Each box was a time capsule, a window into individual lives caught up in the machinery of history. Emma pulled down a box labeled Warsaw Ghetto, Civilian Accounts, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were testimonies typed on thin paper, some in English, others in what she assumed was Polish or Yiddish. Photographs showed streets she recognized from history books, but these weren't the famous images reproduced in textbooks. These were personal snapshots. Children playing in the street before the walls went up, families gathered around dinner tables, young couples smiling at the camera with their whole lives ahead of them. Lives that had been erased, preserved now only in these documents her grandfather had somehow acquired and protected. She set that box aside and reached for another, Vietnam War Conscientious Objectors. This one contained letters written by young men explaining why they couldn't fight, couldn't kill, couldn't reconcile what their government asked of them with what their conscience demanded. Some of the letters were eloquent, philosophical.
Others were simple and direct. "I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I can't." Box after box, story after story. Emma lost track of time, lost herself in the voices of the past. A Japanese woman describing the sound the atomic bomb made, like the world itself breaking in half. A German soldier at Stalingrad writing to his mother about the cold, about watching his friends die, about his growing certainty that he would never see spring again. A nurse at Pearl Harbor detailing the chaos of that Sunday morning, the impossibility of triaging so many wounded, the way some men called for their mothers and others died in silent shock. It was too much. The weight of it, the accumulated grief and fear and desperate hope contained in these boxes, it pressed against Emma's chest until she couldn't breathe. She stood up abruptly, backing away from the shelves, her hand pressed to her sternum. She needed air. I needed space, needed to be anywhere but in this concrete room surrounded by the ghosts of history. Emma stumbled back through the basement and up the stairs, leaving the lights on, leaving the archive door open. She burst through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard, gulping down the humid morning air like a drowning person breaking the surface. The sun was fully up now, turning the sky a hazy gold. The yard was overgrown. Grandpa Samuel hadn't been able to maintain it in his final years, and it had gone wild. Grass up to my knees, flower beds choked with weeds, the old vegetable garden in the corner completely overtaken by ivy and bindweed. But the oak tree was still there. The massive old oak that had stood in this yard for probably 100 years, its branches spreading out like a benediction. Emma walked to it on unsteady legs and sat down at its base, her back against the rough bark, her eyes closed. She stayed there until her breathing slowed, until the panic that had been rising in her chest subsided. Then she pulled out her phone and did what she probably should have done hours ago. She started researching. How much would a collection like this be worth?
The answer, she discovered, was complicated. Historical documents didn't have fixed values the way artwork or rare books did. Their worth depended on provenance, authenticity, uniqueness, and market demand. A letter from a common soldier might be valuable to historians, but worthless on the open market. A letter from a famous figure discussing a significant event could sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars. But a collection? A comprehensive, well-preserved archive of primary sources from major historical events? Emma found articles about similar collections being donated to universities, being purchased by museums, being sold at auction. The numbers made her head spin. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sometimes millions. The Anne Frank correspondence alone, if it was authentic, if it contained unpublished material, could be worth more than the house itself. She sat under the oak tree with her phone in her hand and tried to process what this meant. Financially, it was life-changing. She was 28 years old, working as a freelance graphic designer, living in a studio apartment in Richmond and barely making rent most months. This collection could pay off her student loans, could give her a cushion, some security, the freedom to take risks with her career. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite name, a sense of responsibility that felt almost crushing. These weren't just valuable documents, they were stories, real people's real lives preserved by her grandfather for reasons she still didn't understand. What did he want her to do with them? Emma's phone rang, jarring her out of her thoughts. Her mother, again. "Hi, Mom. You didn't call me back last night. I was worried." Emma looked at the house, at the basement windows set low in the foundation. From here, you couldn't see the hidden archive, couldn't sense what was contained behind those walls. "Sorry, I got caught up sorting through things. How bad is it?" Emma laughed, the sound coming out sharper than she intended. It's complicated. Do you want me to come help? I can drive down this weekend. We can tackle it together." The offer was surprising. Her mother had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with the house, with the sorting and the memories and the emotional labor of dismantling her father's life. But maybe she felt guilty about leaving it all to Emma. Or maybe she was just worried that Emma would get too sentimental, would drag the process out indefinitely. "No,"
Emma said. "Not yet. I need some time to get my bearings, to figure out what we're dealing with." A pause. "There's something in the basement," Emma interrupted. "Something important. I found it yesterday." Another pause, longer this time. "What do you mean, important?" Emma closed her eyes, trying to figure out how to explain. Grandpa Samuel had a collection. Historical documents. Letters, diaries, photographs from World War II, mostly. Maybe other periods too. I haven't gone through everything yet. But, Mom, I think it might be valuable. Really valuable. Silence on the other end. Then, what kind of valuables? I don't know yet. I need to have things authenticated, appraised, but from what I found so far, Emma took a breath. It could be worth a lot of money. How much is a lot? I don't know. Maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars? Maybe more. The silence stretched out so long that Emma pulled the phone away from her ear to check if the call had dropped, but her mother was still there, still connected, just not speaking. Finally, "Your grandfather had something worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in his basement, and he never mentioned it." "It looks that way?" "That doesn't make sense. Why would he—" Her mother's voice trailed off, then came back sharper. "Are you sure? Emma, don't get your hopes up. You know how this goes. People think they found treasure in their attic, and it turns out to be worthless reproductions or... These aren't reproductions. They're real, Mom. Primary sources, first-hand accounts, the kind of thing museums and universities would want." "Then why didn't he donate them? Your father was a history professor, for God's sakes. If he had materials that were valuable, he would have done something with them. He would have told someone."
That was the question, wasn't it? Emma looked up through the branches of the oak tree at the sky beyond. "I don't know. Maybe he was planning to. Maybe he ran out of time. Or maybe they're not what you think they are." Emma felt irritation flare in her chest. "Why are you always like this? Like what? Dismissive, critical. Can't you just, for once, be excited about something? Can't you just acknowledge that this might be important?" "I'm trying to protect you from disappointment." Her mother's voice had gone cold now, withdrawn. "You get enthusiastic about things, Emma. You build them up in your head, and then when reality doesn't match your expectations, you crash. I've watched you do it your whole life." The words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because there was truth in them. But this was different. This wasn't some flight of fancy or impulsive decision. This was real, tangible, sitting in boxes in the basement. "I need to go," Emma said. "I have work to do." "Emma!" She ended the call and sat there under the tree, her phone hot in her hand, her jaw clenched. The morning had turned fully bright now, the sun burning off the last of the dawn haze. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower started up. Normal sounds of a normal day. But nothing felt normal anymore. Emma pushed herself to her feet and walked back into the house. She made herself eat something, toast with peanut butter, mechanical and tasteless, and drank another cup of coffee. Then she went to her grandfather's study and sat at his desk. The unfinished letter was still there. She picked it up and read it again, slowly this time, looking for clues. "There's something I need to tell you about the basement." What had he been planning to say? What instructions had he meant to leave? Emma set the letter down and began opening drawers. The desk had 5 of them, 3 small ones across the top and 2 deep ones on either side. The top drawers held the usual detritus: pens, paper clips, rubber bands, old stamps. The bottom right drawer was full of files, tax returns, insurance documents, the mundane paperwork of life. But the bottom left drawer was locked. Emma jiggled the handle, confirming it. Then she started searching for a key. She went through the other drawers more carefully, checking the backs and undersides. Nothing.
She searched the desk's surface, lifted the stone paperweight she'd given him all those years ago. Nothing there either. Where would he have kept a key? Emma sat back in the chair and looked around the study. Her grandfather had been methodical, organized in his way. If he'd locked something, he'd have put the key somewhere logical, somewhere he could access easily. Her eyes landed on the bookshelf nearest the desk. It was filled with dictionaries and reference books, the kind of thing a writer would keep within arm's reach. And there, on the second shelf, was a hollowed-out book. She had given him that too, actually, a gift from her teenage years when she thought hidden compartments were the height of sophistication. It was a fake book titled The Complete Works of William Shakespeare, but inside was a small metal box. Emma pulled it from the shelf and opened it. Inside were several keys, all unlabeled. She tried them one by one in the desk drawer until the fourth key clicked and the lock released. The drawer slid open. Inside was a leather journal, worn and creased from years of handling. Emma lifted it out carefully and opened to the first page. Collection Log, 1983 to 2024. Her grandfather's handwriting filled page after page. Dates, sources, brief descriptions. Emma flipped through, her eyes catching fragments of entries. March 15th, 1987. Acquired 17 letters from estate sale in Philadelphia. Correspondence between two brothers during Battle of the Bulge. One survived, one didn't. Letters show the strain of not knowing, of waiting for news. Paid $300 for the collection, probably overpaid, but couldn't leave them there. June 3, 1991. Met with Helen Rosenbaum at the community center. She's 76 and wants someone to preserve her mother's diary from the Warsaw Ghetto. My daughter isn't interested in keeping it. Can't let this be lost. She gifted it to me with tears in her eyes, said it was good to know someone would care for it. October 22, 1998. Found cache of letters at flea market in North Carolina. The seller had no idea what they were, thought they were just old paper. Vietnam War correspondence, mostly from conscientious objectors. Heartbreaking reading. Paid $50 for the box. Worth is immeasurable. Entry after entry, year after year. Emma read them all, cover to cover, watching her grandfather's collection grow from a handful of documents to a comprehensive archive. And with each entry, she began to understand. He hadn't been collecting these materials because they were valuable. He'd been collecting them because they mattered, because they were stories that needed to be preserved, voices that deserved to be heard. He'd spent decades and thousands of dollars, money he probably couldn't spare on a professor's salary, hunting down fragments of human experience and protecting them from being lost or destroyed or thrown away as worthless junk. And he'd never told anyone because why? Emma found the answer near the end of the journal, in an entry dated 5 years earlier. I should donate all of this. I know I should. It belongs in an institution where scholars can access it, where it can be properly archived and preserved beyond my lifetime. But I can't seem to let go. These aren't just documents to me. They're people. I know their stories, their fears, their hopes. I've been their keeper for so long. What happens to them when I'm gone? Will they be valued? Will they be treated with the respect they deserve? Or will they become just another collection, gathering dust in some university basement, forgotten again? Emma visited today. She's graduating college in the spring. Smart, curious, compassionate, everything I could have hoped for in a granddaughter. She listened to my stories about the war, about the people I've researched over the years. Really listened, in a way no one else does anymore. Maybe she's the answer. Maybe she's the one who should decide what happens to all of this. Emma's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and kept reading. I need to tell her. Need to explain what I've built here and why. Need to trust that she'll understand, that she'll know what to do, but not yet. She's still finding her way in the world, has her whole life ahead of her. I don't want to burden her with this responsibility before she's ready. Soon, though. Soon I'll tell her everything." The journal ended there. No final entry explaining his plans, no instructions for what Emma should do. Just the trust of a grandfather who believed his granddaughter would understand, would honor what he'd tried to preserve. Emma closed the journal and sat in the quiet of the study. Outside, the world continued its ordinary day. Inside, she felt the weight of a legacy settling onto her shoulders. Her mother wanted to hire a company to clear out the house in 2 days, wanted to reduce her father's entire life to keep, donate, trash, to sell what was valuable and dispose of the rest. She had no idea what she was asking Emma to destroy, but Emma knew now. Knew what was at stake, knew that the boxes in the basement weren't just worth money, they were worth something far more precious. They were proof that individual lives mattered, that personal stories had value, and that the people who'd lived through history's darkest moments deserved to be remembered as fully human. She couldn't let them disappear, couldn't let her grandfather's life work be dispersed or destroyed. But she also couldn't do this alone. Emma pulled out her phone and started searching for historians who specialized in 20th century primary sources, for archivists who could help authenticate and appraise the collection, for lawyers who understood estate law and cultural heritage preservation. The task ahead was enormous. It would take months, maybe years. It would require expertise she didn't have, resources she couldn't afford, decisions she wasn't qualified to make. But as she sat in her grandfather's chair, surrounded by his books, holding his journal, Emma felt something click into place, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. This was why she had come back, not just to clean out a house, not just to say goodbye, but to continue something her grandfather had started, to honor his work, to make sure these voices weren't lost. She just had to figure out how.
Dr. Catherine Wells arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, driving a sensible gray sedan and carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Emma. She was in her mid-50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Emma had found her through the university where her grandfather had taught. She was the head of their special collections department and had agreed to come look at the archive, though her email had been cautious, almost skeptical. Emma met her at the door, suddenly self-conscious about her jeans and faded t-shirt, about the state of the house with its layers of dust and unopened mail piled on the entry table. But Dr. Wells barely glanced at the interior. She shook Emma's hand with a firm grip and said, "Show me what you found." They went down to the basement together. Emma had spent the past 3 weeks cataloging, photographing, creating a preliminary inventory of the collection. She'd barely left the house except to buy groceries and more archival supplies. Her mother had called twice, each conversation growing more tense, more insistent that Emma stop wasting time and hire the estate cleanout company. Emma had stopped answering after the second call. Now she led Dr. Wells through the basement to the hidden door, watched the historian's face as she took in the archive for the first time. There was a long moment of silence. Then Dr. Wells set down her briefcase and stepped forward, her fingers reaching toward the nearest box before stopping, hovering, as if she were afraid to touch something sacred. "How many boxes?" Her voice was quiet, careful. 53 total. I've opened about 40 of them so far. And they're all like this. Primary sources from World War II and related conflicts? Mostly. There are some collections from Vietnam, Korea, even a few boxes from World War I. And there's correspondence that spans decades, follow-up letters, survivor testimonies collected years after the events. Dr. Wells pulled out her phone and turned on its flashlight, adding to the illumination from Emma's camping lantern. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading labels, occasionally making small sounds, not quite gasps, but sharp intakes of breath that suggested recognition, surprise,
disbelief. She stopped at a box labeled Anne Frank, Correspondence Collection, and turned to Emma. "May I?" Emma nodded. Dr. Wells lifted the box from the shelf with both hands, treating it like it might shatter. She set it on the floor and knelt beside it, opening the lid with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Inside were letters protected in archival sleeves, along with a typed inventory in Samuel Hartley's meticulous handwriting. The historian pulled out the first letter and held it up to her phone's light. Emma watched her face, watched the professional skepticism give way to something else. Wonder, maybe, or shock. "This is—" Dr. Wells' voice caught. She cleared her throat. "This appears to be a letter from Otto Frank to a colleague in Switzerland, dated 1952, discussing the publication of his daughter's diary, his grief, his hopes that her story would matter." She looked up at Emma. "If this is authentic, and I'll need to verify that, of course, but if it is, I've never seen this letter before. It's not in any published collection I'm aware of." "My grandfather's journal says he acquired it from an estate sale in Amsterdam in 1989. He corresponded with the seller for months, verified its provenance. There's documentation in the box." Dr. Wells carefully returned the letter and pulled out the next item, then the next. She spent 20 minutes going through just that one box, and Emma could see her hands beginning to shake. Finally, the historian sat back on her heels and looked at Emma with an expression that was difficult to read. "Your grandfather never mentioned this collection? Never wrote about it? Never tried to publish any findings?" "Not that I know of. I think he kept it secret, deliberately." "But why? Do you have any idea how valuable this is? Not just financially, though yes, that too, but academically, historically." Dr. Wells gestured to the shelves. "If even a fraction of these documents are authentic and previously uncatalogued, this is a major discovery. This is the kind of thing that makes careers, that fills gaps in our understanding of these periods. Why would a historian of your grandfather's caliber hide something like this?" Emma had thought about this question constantly over the past 3 weeks. She had read and reread his journal, had searched through his papers for clues. "I think he was protective. He saw these as people's stories, not just historical artifacts. He was afraid they wouldn't be treated with respect, that they'd be reduced to footnotes or fighting points in academic papers. He wanted them to be remembered as humans, not just data." Dr. Wells was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on the Anne Frank box. "That's both beautiful and incredibly frustrating. These stories deserve to be heard. They deserve to be part of the historical record."
"I know. That's why I called you." The historian looked up sharply. "What are you asking me to do exactly?" "I need help. I need to know what I have here, what it's worth, what should be done with it. I need authentication, appraisal, advice on preservation and cataloging. I need—" Emma felt suddenly overwhelmed, the weight of the past 3 weeks pressing down on her. "I need someone who understands what this means, someone who can help me honor what my grandfather was trying to do." Dr. Wells stood up slowly, brushing dust from her knees. She looked around the small archive, at the boxes that lined every shelf, at the decades of careful curation hidden behind a basement door. "This is going to take months, maybe longer. Authentication alone will be an enormous undertaking. We'll need to verify provenance for each collection, cross-reference with known sources, and potentially bring in specialists for certain materials. And that's before we even begin discussing what to do with everything." "I understand. And you need to understand that this is going to be complicated. Once word gets out, and it will get out, Emma, this kind of discovery doesn't stay secret, you're going to have a lot of people interested. Museums, universities, private collectors, auction houses. There will be competing claims, ethical questions about ownership and access. debates about whether materials should be sold or donated. Your life is about to get very difficult. Emma thought about her mother's voice on the phone, insistent and dismissive. Thought about her tiny apartment in Richmond, about the freelance work she'd been neglecting for weeks. Thought about how much easier it would be to just let the estate company come in and clear everything out, to walk away and return to her simple, uncomplicated life. But she also thought about the letters she'd read, the voices of people who'd lived through unimaginable circumstances and found the strength to document their experiences, to leave some record of their existence. They deserved better than to be thrown away or sold to the highest bidder without consideration for their humanity. "I know it's going to be difficult," Emma said, "but it's important, more important than easy." Dr. Wells studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let me make some calls. I know people who can help with authentication and appraisal. We'll need to establish security measures for the collection. This house is not secure enough for materials of this value. We'll need to discuss insurance, legal protections, potentially moving some items to climate-controlled storage. And we'll need to start building a comprehensive catalog so we know exactly what we're dealing with." "Thank you." Emma felt relief wash through her, the first she had felt in weeks. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone else understood, someone else cared. "Don't thank me yet," Dr. Wells said. "This is just the beginning. The hard part comes next." She was right. Within a week, Dr. Wells had assembled a small team. There was Marcus Chen, a document specialist who spent 2 full days examining papers and photographs, testing paper composition and ink age. There was Dr. Yael Stein, who flew in from New York specifically to examine the Holocaust-related materials. There was Thomas Brennan, an appraiser who dealt in historical documents and could provide preliminary valuations. They came 1 or 2 at a time, always with appointments carefully coordinated by Dr. Wells to avoid overwhelming the house or the collection. Each one descended into the basement and emerged hours later looking dazed, excited, occasionally moved to tears. The consensus was unanimous. The collection was authentic, comprehensive, and historically significant. The preliminary appraisals suggested a value between $3 and $8 million, depending on how materials were sold or donated, and to whom. $8 million. Emma had trouble processing that number. It didn't feel real. She'd walk through the house, past her grandfather's worn furniture and faded curtains, and think, all this time he'd been living modestly, sometimes struggling financially in retirement, and he'd been sitting on millions of dollars in historical documents. But he didn't care about that. The journal made it clear. He cared about the stories, about being their keeper. The news started to leak out around the second week, despite everyone's agreements about confidentiality. Someone told someone who told someone else, and suddenly Emma's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Auction houses sent representatives. A lawyer from a major museum called to discuss potential donation arrangements. A documentary filmmaker left 3 voicemails about wanting to tell the story of the discovery. And her mother called. $8 million. There was no greeting, no preamble, just those 3 words spoken with a kind of stunned disbelief. "Emma, someone from the Washington Post called me asking for comment on your grandfather's secret collection worth $8 million. Emma, I was going to tell you."
When? When were you going to tell me that my father had $8 million in historical documents hidden in his basement? When were you going to mention that you'd been sitting on this information for weeks while I've been asking you to just hire someone to clean out the house? Emma closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her forehead. She was sitting in her grandfather's study, surrounded by papers and notes, and she suddenly felt exhausted. It's not that simple. It seems pretty simple to me. We have something valuable. We sell it, split the proceeds, and move on with our lives. These aren't just valuable objects, Mom. They're people's stories, letters they wrote, diaries they kept, testimonies they gave. We can't just sell them to the highest bidder without thinking about what that means. Why not?
We didn't write these letters. We're not obligated to preserve them or honor them or whatever noble crusade you're on. Your grandfather chose to collect these things, chose to hide them away where no one could benefit from them. That was his decision. But he's gone now, and we're left dealing with the consequences. The consequence being that we inherit something of value. The consequence being that you've turned this into some kind of mission. Emma, I know you. You get fixated on things, you build them up, you make them more important than they are. This is just stuff. Valuable stuff, yes, but still just stuff. Emma felt anger flare hot and bright in her chest. Is that really what you think? That I'm just being dramatic? That this doesn't matter? I think you're avoiding your real life. You've been in that house for a month. When are you coming home? When are you getting back to your actual work, your actual responsibilities? This is my responsibility now. Grandpa left this to me, not us, me. He wanted me to decide what to do with it. There was a long silence. When her mother spoke again, her voice was cold. He left the house and its contents to you, yes, but legally, as his daughter, I have rights too. If you won't handle this appropriately, I can petition the court to intervene. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. You're threatening to sue me? I'm trying to get you to be reasonable. Sell the collection, Emma. Let the experts handle it. Take the money and build something good with your life instead of hiding in the past. I'm not hiding. I'm trying to honor what Grandpa built. Your grandfather was a lonely old man who filled his basement with other people's tragedies because he couldn't deal with his own. Don't make the same mistake. The line went dead. Emma sat in the silent study, her phone still pressed to her ear, feeling like she'd been punched. Her mother's words echoed in her head. A lonely old man who filled his basement with other people's tragedies. Was that true? Was that how her mother had seen her own father? As pathetic, as desperate, as someone who'd wasted his life on meaningless obsession? Emma set the phone down and looked around the study. At the books that lined every wall, each one chosen deliberately, each one read and annotated. At the typewriter where her grandfather had spent countless hours working on research papers and lectures. At the stone paperweight she'd given him, still in its place of honor on the desk. This wasn't the room of a lonely, desperate man. This was the room of someone who'd been deeply engaged with the world, with history, with the human experience. Someone who'd cared so much about preserving stories that he dedicated decades of his life to the task. But her mother couldn't see that, or wouldn't. The next week brought more complications. A lawyer representing a Holocaust museum in Israel sent a formal letter claiming that any materials related to the Holocaust are cultural property that should be repatriated. A descendant of one of the soldiers whose letters are in the collection demanded their return, saying they're family property that had been sold without proper authority. An ethics professor published an op-ed questioning whether private individuals should be allowed to control access to historically significant documents. Dr. Wells helped Emma navigate each challenge, responding to claims, verifying legal standing, consulting with lawyers who specialized in cultural property law. But the pressure was mounting. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had an opinion about what should be done with the collection. And then the break-in happened. Emma had gone out for groceries, her first trip away from the house in days. She was gone for maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours at most. When she pulled back into the driveway, she knew immediately something was wrong. The front door was standing open, swinging slightly in the afternoon breeze. Her heart hammering, Emma pulled out her phone and called 911. Then she waited in her car, watching the house, until the police arrived. 2 officers went inside while she stood on the front lawn, her hands shaking, imagining what she might find. They emerged 15 minutes later. The house is clear, the older officer said, but you're going to want to come look at the damage. The study had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out and dumped, books swept from shelves, papers scattered everywhere.
The basement was worse. Boxes had been opened and upended, their contents spilled across the concrete floor. The hidden archive had been discovered. Of course it had been discovered. Emma had been going in and out of it constantly, and several boxes were missing entirely. Emma stood in the middle of the chaos and felt tears streaming down her face, not because of the mess, not because of the violation of the space, but because she'd failed. She'd been entrusted with protecting these materials, these stories, and she'd failed. The police took statements, dusted for fingerprints, told her they'd do what they could, but not to get her hopes up. Break-ins were common, and without security cameras or witnesses, there was little to go on. After they left, Emma sat on the basement stairs and called Dr. Wells. "I should have listened to you," Emma said, her voice hollow. "You told me the house wasn't secure. You told me we needed to move things to proper storage. But I don't know what I thought. That I could keep them safe. That was enough." "How many boxes were taken?" Dr. Wells's voice was calm, professional, but Emma could hear the concern underneath. 3, maybe 4? It's hard to tell with everything scattered. But Emma, they took the Anne Frank correspondence. They took some of the Pearl Harbor materials. They knew what was valuable. "This wasn't random," Dr. Wells said. "Someone specifically targeted the most significant collections." Who would do this? Who even knew enough about what was here? Word has been spreading in collectors' circles, and not all collectors operate ethically. There's a black market for materials like this, private buyers who don't care about provenance or legal ownership, who just want to possess something rare and valuable. Emma closed her eyes. What do I do? First, you don't beat yourself up. This isn't your fault. You didn't have the resources or knowledge to secure a collection like this properly. Second, we file reports with every relevant authority. Third, we accelerate our plans to move everything to secure storage. And fourth, we make it known publicly that those stolen materials are stolen. Make them too hot to sell, too risky to possess. And if they're already gone, if someone has them locked away in a private collection somewhere? Dr. Wells was quiet for a moment. Then we hope that someday, somehow, they resurface. But Emma, we can't let this derail everything. There are still 49 boxes down there, still thousands of documents that need protection and preservation. We focus on saving what we can. Emma spent the rest of the day cleaning up, carefully gathering scattered papers and photographs, trying to reassemble what had been destroyed. Some materials were damaged, torn or crumpled in the chaos. Some were mixed together from different collections and would take hours to properly resort. But as she worked, Emma felt something shifting inside her. The violation, the loss, the overwhelming pressure of the past month, it was all crystallizing into something harder, more determined. She'd been treating this as a private family matter, as something she could handle quietly on her own. But it was bigger than that. It was important enough that people would break the law to possess pieces of it, which meant it was important enough to fight for. That night, she called a press conference. Dr. Wells helped her organize it, setting it up in the university's event space with proper security and media protocols. Emma had never spoken to reporters before, had certainly never imagined she'd be standing at a podium in front of 24 journalists with cameras and microphones. But there she was, wearing a borrowed blazer over her nicest jeans, reading from a statement she'd written at 3 in the morning. "My name is Emma Hartley. My grandfather, Dr. Samuel Hartley, was a history professor at this university for 37 years. He passed away 3 months ago, and in the process of managing his estate, I discovered something remarkable. For decades, my grandfather had been quietly collecting primary source materials from World War II and related conflicts. Letters, diaries, photographs, personal testimonies from people who lived through some of the 20th century's most significant events. This wasn't an investment for him. It wasn't about monetary value. My grandfather collected these materials because he believed every person's story mattered. He believed that history isn't just about generals and politicians and major battles. It's about individuals. The soldier who wrote letters home, the civilian who kept a diary during occupation, the survivor who gave testimony years later, making sure the truth wouldn't be forgotten.
3 days ago, someone broke into my grandfather's house and stole several boxes from this collection. They took materials that are irreplaceable, documents that represent real people's real lives. I'm asking whoever has them to return them. Not to me, I don't care about that, but to history, to the people whose stories they tell. And I'm making an announcement. After consulting with historians, archivists, and legal experts, I've decided to donate the entire collection to a consortium of institutions that specialize in preserving and providing access to materials like these: museums, universities, research libraries, places where scholars and students and anyone who cares about history can study these documents, places where they'll be protected, cataloged, and treated with the respect they deserve. My grandfather spent his life protecting these stories. I'm going to make sure his work wasn't in vain. The questions came fast after that. How much was the collection worth? Why donate instead of sell? What about her family? Did they support this decision? What about the break-in? Did she have suspects? Emma answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't. Dr. Wells stood beside her, occasionally stepping in with technical details or clarifications. And through it all, Emma felt a strange calm settling over her. She was doing the right thing. She knew it with the certainty she'd rarely felt about anything in her life. The press conference made national news. By the next morning, Emma's face was on the front page of several major newspapers. The story hit social media and went viral. People were fascinated by the idea of hidden treasure discovered in a grandfather's basement, moved by Emma's decision to donate rather than sell. But not everyone was supportive. Her mother showed up the next day, arriving without warning, her face tight with fury. She pushed past Emma into the house and turned on her in the foyer. "How dare you?" Emma closed the door quietly. "Mum, how dare you make a decision like that without consulting me? This is my inheritance too. Legally, morally, I have a say in what happens to these materials. Dad left them to me. He chose me to make these decisions. Because he was his favorite. Because you indulged his obsessions and listened to his endless stories and made him feel like his hoarding had meaning. But that doesn't give you the right to give away millions of dollars without even discussing it with me? This isn't about money. Of course it's about money. This could have changed both our lives. And you gave it away to make some grand gesture?" Emma felt something snap inside her. "You think this is about playing hero? Mom, someone broke into this house and stole pieces of history because they were valuable enough to risk jail time for. People are fighting over who has rights to these materials, who gets to control them. If I sold the collection, it would be scattered to private collectors and locked away where no one could access it. Grandpa didn't preserve these stories for 50 years so someone could put them in a vault and treat them like investments. Your grandfather was foolish. He wasted his money and his time on this collection instead of securing his own future, instead of making sure his family would be taken care of. And now you're being just as foolish." Maybe. Or maybe some things are more important than being comfortable. Her mother stared at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "You're making a mistake. A huge mistake. And when you realize it, when the praise dies down and you're back in your tiny apartment working freelance jobs that barely pay the bills, don't come crying to me." "I won't." "Fine." Her mother walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. "He chose you because he knew I'd be practical, because he knew I'd sell. He wanted someone who'd be sentimental, who would prioritize his legacy over common sense. Congratulations, Emma. You're exactly what he wanted." She left, the door closing with a soft click that sounded final. Emma stood alone in the foyer and felt the weight of her decision settling onto her shoulders. Her mother was right about some things. Life was about to get harder. The money from the estate would run out eventually. Her freelance clients were getting impatient with her absences. She'd have to figure out what came next, how to build a life after this was all done. But standing there in her grandfather's house, surrounded by his books and his memories and the stories he'd spent a lifetime protecting, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, even if it cost her everything. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the press conference. Emma almost deleted it, assuming it was another request for an interview or another collector trying to convince her to sell pieces of the collection privately. But something about the subject line made her pause. Samuel Hartley Collection, Personal Connection. She opened it. Dear Miss Hartley, my name is Rachel Bergman. I'm writing to you about your grandfather's collection, specifically regarding materials related to the Warsaw Ghetto. I saw your press conference and the subsequent news coverage, and I believe my grandmother's diary may be among the documents your grandfather preserved. Her name was Miriam Rosenbaum. She survived the ghetto and immigrated to the United States in 1949. She died when I was 12, but I remember her talking about a diary she'd kept during the war. She told me she'd given it to a professor for safekeeping, someone who promised to make sure it wasn't lost. I never knew what happened to it after that, and our family assumed it had been thrown away or lost. If you have it, if it survived, I would very much like to see it. Not to claim it, just to read my grandmother's words, to understand what she lived through in a way she could never talk about out loud. Please let me know if this is possible. With hope, Rachel Bergman. Emma read the email 3 times, her heart beating faster with each read. She went down to the basement. The collection had been moved to climate-controlled university storage, but she'd kept detailed photographs and inventory lists. She pulled up her digital catalog and searched for Rosenbaum. There it was. Warsaw Ghetto, Civilian Accounts, Miriam Rosenbaum Diary, 1941 to 1943. Acquired via donation, June 1991. Emma checked her grandfather's journal entry for that date. Met with Helen Rosenbaum at the community center. She's 76, wants someone to preserve her mother's diary from the Warsaw Ghetto. Daughter isn't interested in keeping it. Can't let this be lost. She gifted it to me with tears in her eyes, said it was good to know someone would care for it. Helen must have been Miriam's daughter, Rachel's mother, the one who hadn't been interested in keeping the diary. But now, years later, the granddaughter was searching for it. Emma's hands were shaking as she typed her response. Dear Rachel, yes, we have your grandmother's diary. It's safe, it's been carefully preserved, and I would be honored to arrange for you to read it. When can you come? They met a week later at the university's Special Collections Reading Room. Dr. Wells had arranged everything, setting up a private space where Rachel could examine the diary without interruption. Emma waited by the window, watching the parking lot until a car pulled in and a woman in her 40s got out. She moved slowly, hesitantly, like someone approaching something they both wanted and feared. Emma met her at the entrance. Rachel Bergman was tall and elegant, with dark hair threaded with gray and her grandmother's eyes. Emma could see it in the photographs that had been included with the diary. They shook hands, and Emma could feel the tremor in her grip. Thank you for this, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't think. I never imagined. Come on, Emma said gently. Dr. Wells is waiting for us. They walked through the university's corridors to the Special Collections Reading Room. Dr. Wells was there, along with Marcus Chen, who'd helped authenticate the diary. The diary itself rested on a cushioned book cradle on the table, already open to the first page. Rachel stopped in the doorway. I saw her eyes lock on the diary, saw her hand come up to cover her mouth. That's her handwriting. Oh God, that's really her handwriting. Dr. Wells stepped forward. Miss Bergman, please, come sit down. Take all the time you need. We'll be just outside if you need anything. Emma started to follow Dr. Wells out, but Rachel reached for her arm. Stay, please. I don't want to be alone with this.
So Emma sat beside her while Rachel carefully turned the pages of her grandmother's diary, reading the words Miriam Rosenbaum had written more than 80 years ago. The entries were in Polish, but there were translations tucked into the protective sleeves. Emma's grandfather had paid someone to translate them, had wanted to understand the stories he was preserving. Rachel read in silence for a long time. Emma watched tears stream down her face, watched her trace her grandmother's words with the finger that didn't quite touch the page.
Sometimes Rachel would gasp softly or shake her head or close her eyes and just breathe. Finally, she looked up at Emma. "She wrote about my mother here, about being pregnant in the ghetto, about being terrified of bringing a child into that hell, but also about hope, about believing somehow they would survive." Emma felt her own throat tighten. "Did your mother ever read this?" Rachel shook her head. "She refused. After my grandmother gave it away, my mother said she was relieved, said she didn't want to know details about what had happened in the ghetto. She'd heard enough as a child, nightmares and screaming, my grandmother's panic attacks. She wanted to focus on the future, not the past." "But you want to know." "I need to know," Rachel said. "My grandmother was the strongest person I ever knew, but I only knew her as this frail old woman who would sometimes stare out the window for hours, somewhere else entirely. I want to understand what made her that way, what she survived, who she was before everything happened." They sat together for 3 hours while Rachel read through the entire diary. By the end, both of them had been crying. The last entry was dated April 1943, just before the ghetto uprising. Miriam had written about hearing gunfire, about smoke rising over the buildings, about not knowing if she and her daughter would see another sunrise. But they had. They'd survived. They'd gotten out somehow. Emma's grandfather's notes indicated Miriam had been smuggled out by the resistance just before the final liquidation. She and Helen had made it to the United States and built a new life. And now, decades later, Miriam's words were reuniting 3 generations of women across time. When they finally left the reading room, Rachel hugged Emma fiercely. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for preserving this. Thank you for letting me see it. Thank you for understanding why it matters." "It was my grandfather," Emma said. "He understood. I wish I could thank him." "Me too." Rachel left with a promise to return, to spend more time with the diary, to perhaps work with the university on preserving her grandmother's story for future researchers. And Emma felt something shift inside her. This was why it mattered. Not the monetary value, not the academic prestige, but this. The moment when history stopped being abstract and became personal, when the past reached forward to touch the present. But Rachel was just the first. Over the next few weeks, more people came forward. A man from Texas whose grandfather had been at Pearl Harbor found letters his grandfather had written describing that day, letters the family had thought were lost when their house flooded in the 70s. A woman from California discovered that her father's testimony about his experiences as a prisoner of war was part of the collection. A veterans organization contacted Emma about photographs that documented their battalion service in the Pacific Theater. Each person who came to view the materials brought their own story, their own connection to the past. Emma found herself becoming a facilitator of reunions between the living and the dead, between descendants and ancestors they'd never known. She watched people cry, laugh, rage, and grieve as they encountered the voices of those who'd come before them. The media attention brought something else too: information about the stolen boxes. A collector in London contacted Dr. Wells to say he'd been approached about purchasing materials from the Anne Frank correspondence. He'd recognized the descriptions from the news coverage and had reported the seller to the authorities. The trail led to a network of black market dealers who specialized in stolen historical documents. 2 men were arrested, and most of the stolen materials were recovered, though some items were still missing. The return of the stolen boxes felt like a victory, but it was bittersweet. Some documents had been damaged in transit. Others had been separated from their contextual materials, making authentication more difficult. But they were back, and that was what mattered.
Emma was in the reading room one afternoon, helping Dr. Wells reorganize the recovered materials when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Emma Hartley. Yes? My name is James Reeves. I'm calling about your grandfather's collection, specifically about a letter I wrote that might be in there. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. You wrote one of the letters? I did. August 1945, from Japan, describing what I saw in Hiroshima 2 days after the bomb. I wrote it to my wife, Margaret. She died 20 years ago, and I thought that letter had died with her. But I saw your press conference, saw you mention Hiroshima materials, and I wondered, Mr. Reeves, how old are you? A dry chuckle. 98. I'm one of the last ones left from that war. Most of my buddies are gone now. But I'm still here, still remembering things I wish I could forget. Emma felt chills run down her spine. She remembered that letter. She'd read it weeks ago, had been haunted by its descriptions of devastation and horror. And now the person who'd written it, who'd witnessed those unimaginable things, was on the phone. His voice thin and reedy, but still vital, still here. "We have your letter, Mr. Reeves. Would you like to see it?" There was a long silence. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, "I'd like that very much. I haven't thought about that letter in 70 years. I wasn't even sure I'd really written it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined things from back then, if my memory is playing tricks. But if you have it, if it's real, and it's remarkable. Your descriptions, your honesty about what you witnessed, historians would be deeply interested in your testimony." I never told anyone what I wrote in that letter. Couldn't. When I came home, everyone wanted to celebrate, wanted to hear about victory and heroism. Nobody wanted to hear about the horror, about children's shadows burned into concrete, about survivors who'd lost their skin, about the smell. His voice cracked. I kept it inside for so long. Thought maybe I should have. Thought maybe some things are better left unspoken. Mr. Reeves, there are people who need to hear your story, not to glorify war or sensationalize suffering, but to understand, to remember, to make sure we never forget what those weapons can do. Another long silence. Then, "Your grandfather, Samuel Hartley, right? I looked him up after I saw your press conference. He was a good man, wasn't he? A man who cared about truth." "Yes," Emma said. "Yes, he was." "Then I'll come. I'll read my letter, and I'll tell you whatever else you want to know. But not for me. I don't need recognition or attention. For them. For all the people who didn't make it home to write letters. Someone should speak for them." James Reeves came to the university 2 weeks later, brought by his grandson who'd driven him from Ohio. Emma met them in the parking lot and was struck by how small he seemed. This man who'd witnessed one of history's most catastrophic moments was barely 5.5 feet tall, stooped with age, walking with a cane. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and his handshake was firm. They'd arranged for him to read his letter privately first, but he insisted Emma stay. "You're Samuel's granddaughter. You should hear this." So Emma sat beside him while he read words he'd written as a young man of 20, fresh from witnessing the end of a war and the dawn of the atomic age. She watched his face as he read, saw him mouth the words silently, saw his hands shake. When he finished, he sat back and was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I was so angry when I wrote this, angry at what we'd done, angry at the celebration back home, angry at my own relief that the war was over. But I was also..." He paused, searching for words. "I was trying to be honest, to document what I'd seen because I knew people would want to forget. I would want to smooth it over, make it simple. Heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. But war isn't simple. Death isn't simple." "Do you regret writing it?" Emma asked. "No," he said firmly. "I regret that I never found the courage to share it. I let fear keep me silent. Thought people would call me unpatriotic. I would say I was dishonoring the sacrifice of those who died. But the real dishonor is forgetting, is pretending it wasn't as bad as it was." Dr. Wells had arranged for a videographer to record an oral history interview with James Reeves. For 3 hours, he talked about growing up during the Depression, about enlisting after Pearl Harbor, about the war in the Pacific, the battles, the friends he had lost,
the things he had seen that still haunted his dreams, and about Hiroshima. He didn't spare the details. He talked about the heat that had melted glass and metal, about the people he had tried to help who'd been burned so badly he couldn't tell if they were men or women, about a child he'd found alive in the rubble who died in his arms while he tried to dig her out, about the sound of survivors moaning for water, for help, for death.
And he talked about returning home, about trying to readjust to normal life, about the nightmares and the guilt and the feeling that he'd left part of himself in the ruins of that city, about his wife, Margaret, who'd been patient with his silences and his distance, who'd held him when he woke up screaming and never asked questions he couldn't answer. "I should have shown her the letter," he said, his voice breaking. "Should have let her understand, but I was ashamed of what I'd seen, what I'd been part of, ashamed that I came home when so many didn't. So I hid it, and then she died, and I thought it was gone forever. But your grandfather kept it, kept my words safe when I couldn't." By the end of the interview, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The videographer had tears streaming down her face. Dr. Wells was openly crying. And Emma felt the full weight of what her grandfather had been preserving. Not just documents, but the humanity contained within them, the pain and courage and impossible complexity of people who'd lived through history and tried to make sense of it. After James Reeves left, promising to return, to do more interviews, to finally share the story he'd kept silent for 70 years, Emma and Dr. Wells sat in the empty reading room. Your grandfather knew. He understood that these stories needed to be kept safe until people were ready to hear them, until descendants came looking, until survivors found the courage to speak. Emma nodded, unable to find words. "This is what archives are supposed to do," Dr. Wells continued. "Not just preserve the past, but create bridges to the future. Your grandfather built those bridges, one document at a time, and now you're helping people cross them." That night, Emma went back to her grandfather's house. It was nearly empty now. Most of the ordinary possessions had been donated or disposed of, the furniture sold, the rooms cleared. The collection was safely stored at the university. The estate lawyer had told her they could list the house for sale anytime she was ready. But Emma wasn't ready. Not yet. She walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing on bare floors, went to the study where her grandfather had spent so many hours typing, researching, corresponding with people who had stories to share. The bookshelves were empty now, but she could still picture them full. Could still see him sitting at his desk, bent over his typewriter, carefully documenting provenance and context for each acquisition. Had he known? Had he imagined that someday his work would bring Rachel Bergman to tears of recognition? That James Reeves would finally share his story? That dozens of people would reconnect with their family histories through the materials he'd preserved? Emma thought about the unfinished letter. "There's something I need to tell you about the basement." Maybe he'd been planning to explain his reasoning, to share his philosophy about preservation and memory and the importance of individual stories. Or maybe he'd simply been planning to ask her to continue his work, to be the next keeper of these stories. She'd never know for certain, but standing in his empty study, feeling his presence in the space he'd occupied for so long, Emma felt like she understood him better than she ever had when he was alive. He'd been a teacher, not just in the classroom, but in the way he'd approached the world. He'd taught that every person mattered, that every story deserved to be heard and remembered, that history wasn't just about the famous and powerful, but about ordinary people living through extraordinary times. And he'd taught Emma, though she was only now fully learning the lesson, that some things were more valuable than money or comfort or convenience. That legacy wasn't about what you accumulated, but what you preserved and passed forward.
that caring for the stories of strangers was a kind of sacred work. Emma pulled out her phone and opened her email. She'd been putting off replying to a message from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the collection. She'd been hesitant about more publicity, worried about exploitation and sensationalism. But now she typed a response. Yes, I'd like to talk about the project, but with some conditions. This isn't about me or my grandfather. It's about the people whose stories we're preserving. If you can honor that, if you can treat their experiences with the respect they deserve, then let's talk. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she sat down on the floor of the empty study, her grandfather's study, and let herself cry. For him, for the loss that had brought her here, for Rachel and James and all the others who'd been reunited with pieces of their history, for the people who'd written the letters and diaries, who'd lived through things that should never have happened, who'd found the strength to document their experiences.
And for herself, for the person she'd been when she first walked into this house 3 months ago. That Emma had been lost and directionless. But now she knew exactly what she was meant to do. She was a keeper of stories, a bridge between past and present, a guardian of voices that refused to be silenced, just like her grandfather had been. The recognition settled over her like a mantle, heavy but not unwelcome. This was her purpose now, her calling, and she would honor it the way Samuel Hartley had honored it, with dedication, with care, with the understanding that some things were worth more than their market value. Emma stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The oak tree in the backyard stood silhouetted against the fading light, its branches reaching upward like hands in prayer. Tomorrow, she would call the estate lawyer and tell him she wasn't selling the house. She would figure out a way to keep it, to turn it into something meaningful, a center for oral history, perhaps, a place where people could come to share their stories and learn about preservation and connect with the past. Tomorrow, she would start planning the next phase of her life, a life dedicated to continuing her grandfather's work. But tonight, she would stand in his empty house and feel grateful. Grateful for the inheritance he'd left her, which had nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. Grateful for the lesson he'd taught her about what mattered in life. Grateful for the trust he'd placed in her to do the right thing. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for believing in me, for knowing I would understand." The house was silent, but somehow Emma felt like he'd heard her, like across the distance between life and death, across the months since she'd last seen him, he was smiling. And she smiled back. The grand opening of the Samuel Hartley Center for Personal Histories took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Emma had first walked into her grandfather's house and discovered the basement archive. The house had been transformed, walls removed to create open spaces, the basement professionally renovated into a climate-controlled storage facility, the study preserved exactly as it had been, now serving as a memorial to the man who'd started it all. Emma stood on the front lawn watching people arrive, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She was nervous in a way she hadn't expected to be. This had been her vision, her project for the past year, consuming every waking hour and most of her savings. But now that it was real, now that people were actually here to see what she'd built, she felt vulnerable, exposed. Dr. Catherine Wells arrived first as promised, carrying a box of pastries from the bakery downtown. "Thought we could use fortification," she said, pressing the box into Emma's hands. "How are you holding up?" "Terrified," Emma admitted. "What if no one cares? What if this whole thing is just my own private obsession and nobody else sees the value?" Dr. Wells smiled and gestured to the street where cars were beginning to line up, looking for parking. "I think you're about to discover you're not alone in this obsession." She was right. By 10 o'clock, when Emma officially opened the doors, there were over 100 people waiting to enter. Some were academics, historians, and archivists from universities across the country who'd heard about the collection. Others were descendants of people whose stories were preserved in the archive. Still others were simply curious community members who'd followed the story in the news and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Emma had prepared a short speech, something formal and appropriate about preservation and memory and her grandfather's legacy, but standing there in the foyer where she'd first caught the scent of time and old paper, looking at all these faces full of anticipation and interest, the prepared words fled from her mind. Instead, she said simply, "Welcome to my grandfather's house. Welcome to the stories he spent his life protecting. Thank you for caring enough to come." The day unfolded like a dream. People moved through the center in small groups, examining the exhibits Emma had created with Dr. Wells's help. Display cases held selected documents, letters, photographs, diary pages, each one accompanied by context cards explaining who had written them and why they mattered. Interactive digital stations allowed visitors to explore the full catalog of the collection, to search for materials by date or location or theme. But the heart of the center was the oral history recording studio. Emma had converted what had been her grandfather's bedroom into a professional space where people could record their own stories, their own testimonies about family history or personal experiences. The idea was to continue her grandfather's work, to keep collecting, keep preserving, keep creating bridges between past and present. Rachel Bergman was the first person to use the studio. She sat in front of the camera, her grandmother's diary open on her lap, and told the story of Miriam Rosenbaum. Not just what was in the diary, but what came after. How Miriam had built a life in America despite her trauma. How she had raised a daughter who'd struggled with the weight of inherited pain. How Rachel herself had spent years trying to understand her family's story, only to find pieces of it preserved here, in this house, by a man she'd never met.
"Samuel Hartley gave my family a gift," Rachel said, her eyes shining with tears. "He gave us back part of our history that we thought was lost forever. He helped me understand my grandmother, not just as a survivor, but as a person. A full, complex, remarkable person who lived through horror and still found ways to love and hope and create beauty." Emma watched from behind the camera, her throat tight. This was what her grandfather had wanted, not just to preserve documents, but to honor the people behind them, to make sure their full humanity was remembered. James Reeves came next, though he'd already done extensive interviews with the university. He wanted to record something specifically for the center's collection, something that would live in the house where his letter had been kept safe for so long. "I spent 70 years trying to forget," he said, his 98-year-old voice steady and clear. "Thought that was what I was supposed to do. Move on. Look forward. Don't dwell in the past. But forgetting isn't the same as healing. I know that now. And maybe if more of us had talked about what we saw, what we did, what was done in our names, maybe we'd have learned something. Maybe we'd have made different choices." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "So this is for anyone watching who has a story they're keeping silent, who thinks their experience doesn't matter or wouldn't be understood. Tell it anyway. Document it somehow. Because someday, someone's going to come looking for the truth, and they're going to need your words, your perspective, your humanity." The interviews continued throughout the day. A woman whose father had been a Tuskegee airman found photographs of his squadron in the collection and recorded stories about his service that he'd never shared with her during his life. A man whose uncle had been a conscientious objector during Vietnam read his uncle's letters and wept, finally understanding the courage it had taken to stand against the war. A teacher brought her class of high school students, and several of them volunteered to record their own family stories, Immigrant experiences, civil rights activism, military service across generations. By the end of the day, Emma was exhausted but exhilarated. The center had received pledges of support from 3 major foundations, commitments from a dozen scholars to use the archive for research, and over 50 people had signed up to contribute their own stories to the growing collection. But the moment that mattered most came near closing time when Emma was saying goodbye to the last visitors. A man approached her hesitantly, an older gentleman with kind eyes and graying hair. "Miss Hartley, I'm David Chen. I'm a nephew of Marcus Chen, who helped authenticate your grandfather's collection." Emma recognized the name. Marcus had mentioned his uncle several times, always with obvious affection. "It's nice to meet you. Marcus has been invaluable in getting all this organized." "He speaks highly of you too," David said, "but I'm not here about the collection exactly. I'm here about your grandfather, Samuel Hartley." Something in his tone made Emma's attention sharpen. "Did you know him?" "I did, actually. We were colleagues at the university, though in different departments. I taught literature while he was in history. But we became friends. Used to have coffee every Friday afternoon, talked about books and teaching and life. He was a good man, a good friend." Emma felt a lump forming in her throat. "I didn't realize. I guess I always assumed he was pretty solitary after my grandmother died." "He was private, yes, but not lonely. He had his routines, his interests, his quiet community of people who appreciated the same things he did. And he talked about you constantly. His brilliant granddaughter who was going to do remarkable things. I don't know about brilliant or remarkable. He thought so. Used to show me your designs. You're a graphic designer, right? He was so proud. Kept every email you sent, every photo you shared. You were his connection to the future, I think. His hope that the work he was doing would matter to someone after he was gone." Emma had to look away, blinking hard against tears. "I wish I'd known him better. Really known him, not just the surface version. I visited, but not often enough. And I never asked the right questions." "He knew you cared. That's what mattered to him." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "He gave me this about 6 months before he died. Asked me to hold on to it and give it to you if anything happened to him. I tried to contact you after the funeral, but by the time I tracked down your information, you'd already discovered the collection. I figured you had enough to deal with, so I waited. But seeing all this, what you've built here, I think now's the right time." Emma took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in her grandfather's careful script. She looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. I'll wait." Emma opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of letter paper filled with her grandfather's handwriting. She began to read. "My dear Emma,
If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and David has judged the moment right to give you this letter. I hope you've already discovered what I've been working on all these years. I hope you found the archive and understood what it represents. I need to explain some things that I could never quite figure out how to say in person. You know I'm not good with emotional conversations. Your grandmother used to tease me about being emotionally constipated. But writing has always been easier for me, so let me try to tell you the things I should have said when I had the chance. I started collecting these materials because I was angry. Does that surprise you? Everyone thought I was this calm, scholarly man who approached history with academic detachment, but I was furious. Furious at how quickly we forget, how easily we reduce complex human experiences to simple narratives, how willing we are to discard the voices that don't fit our preferred versions of history. After your grandmother died, the anger got worse. I felt like the world was moving too fast, discarding too much, forgetting too much. Rose was gone, and soon I would be gone. And then everyone we'd known would be gone. And what would be left? What proof would remain that we'd existed, that we'd loved and suffered and tried our best? So I started collecting.
At first it was random, whatever I could find at estate sales and flea markets. But then I realized I could be more deliberate. I could seek out the stories that were in danger of being lost. The ones from people who weren't famous, who didn't have family members interested in preserving their legacies. I could be the keeper they needed. It became my purpose, my reason for getting up each day. And yes, it became an obsession. I spent money I probably shouldn't have spent. I filled my basement with boxes when I should have been living my life, traveling, maybe even finding companionship again. Your mother thinks I was hiding from grief, and maybe she's partly right. But it wasn't just hiding, it was also searching. Searching for meaning, for connection, for proof that individual lives matter. I never knew quite what to do with it all. Should I donate to a museum, create a foundation, write a book? Every option seemed to miss the point somehow. These weren't just artifacts to be cataloged and stored. They were people, and I wanted them to be treated as people, not just sources or data points or exhibits. Then you graduated college, and you started visiting more often, and we'd sit in my study and talk about history and stories and what makes life meaningful. And I started to think, maybe you're the answer. You have your grandmother's compassion and my stubbornness. You care about things deeply. You ask the right questions. You see people, really see them, in a way that most people don't. I wanted to tell you about the archive so many times, but I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I ran out of moments. So now I'm writing this letter and hoping you'll forgive an old man's cowardice. Here's what I want you to know. Whatever you decide to do with the collection, I trust you. Sell it, donate it, burn it if you think that's best. I won't judge from beyond the grave. But I hope you'll consider continuing the work. Not the collecting, necessarily, but the preserving, the honoring of individual stories, the insistence that every person's experience matters. We live in a world that's increasingly focused on the big picture, the grand narrative, the sweeping trends. But history isn't just made by presidents and generals and movements. It's made by ordinary people living through extraordinary times and trying to make sense of their experiences. Those are the stories that get lost most easily. Those are the voices that need keepers. I know I'm asking a lot. I know you have your own life to live, your own dreams to pursue. But Emma, you have a gift for making people feel seen and heard. You had it even as a child. Do you remember bringing me that river stone and acting like it was the most precious thing in the world? You made me feel like my appreciation mattered, like my perspective had value. You've done that your whole life, probably without even realizing it. So here's my final request. Whatever you decide about the collection, promise me you'll keep telling stories, keep asking questions, keep insisting that individual lives matter. Do it through your art, your work, your conversations, however it makes sense for you. Just don't let the world convince you that ordinary people and ordinary moments aren't worth preserving and celebrating. I love you, Emma. I'm proud of who you've become, and I'm grateful that my granddaughter turned out to be exactly the kind of person this world needs more of. Your loving grandfather, Samuel. Emma read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. When she finally looked up, David was watching her with gentle concern. "Are you all right?" Emma laughed, wiping her eyes. Yeah, I think I am. He knew. He knew what I'd do with the collection. He trusted me to figure it out." He did. And looking around at what you've built here, David gestured to the center, to the visitors still browsing exhibits, to the recording studio where a teenage girl was setting up to tell her family's immigration story. I'd say his trust was well placed. After David left, Emma walked through the center alone, turning off lights, straightening chairs, letting the quiet settle around her. The house felt different now, not empty, like it had been for those weeks after she'd cleared it out, but full in a new way, full of possibility, full of purpose. She ended up in her grandfather's study, the one room she'd preserved exactly as it had been. His typewriter still sat on the desk, though she'd had it professionally cleaned and serviced. His books lined the shelves, organized the way he'd kept them. And the Riverstone paperweight held down a guest book where visitors to the center could leave comments and reflections. Emma picked up the stone and felt its familiar weight in her palm. She remembered the day she'd found it, how proud she'd been to give it to her grandfather, how he'd made her feel like she'd given him something precious. Now she understood. It hadn't been about the stone itself. It had been about the gesture, about the connection, about the act of seeing something ordinary and recognizing its value. That's what her grandfather had done his whole life, seen ordinary people's stories and recognized their extraordinary value. That's what Emma was doing now. She set the stone back down and opened the guest book to read some of the entries from today's visitors. Thank you for reminding us that every life is a story worth preserving. Sarah M. My grandmother's diary is here. I didn't know it still existed. I'm crying in a stranger's house and feeling grateful. Michael K. This is what archives should be, not cold institutional spaces, but warm places that honor human connection. Dr. Lisa Park, University of Maryland. I came here skeptical and left believing in the importance of this work. Thank you. James R. Page after page of comments, of gratitude, of recognition that what had been built here mattered. Emma's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Wells. Congratulations on a successful opening. Your grandfather would be so proud. I know I am. Another text, this one from Rachel Bergman. Thank you for today. Thank you for everything. My family is forever grateful. And then one more from a number she didn't recognize. This is James Reeves. My grandson is helping me text. Thank you for giving an old man's words new life. Thank you for making sure they matter. Emma sat at her grandfather's desk and let herself feel the full weight of gratitude and accomplishment and profound satisfaction. This was what purpose felt like. This was what it meant to do work that mattered. Her mother hadn't come to the opening, though Emma had sent her an invitation. They'd spoken only twice in the past year, both conversations brief and stilted. The rift between them felt permanent now, a canyon too wide to bridge. It hurt, but Emma had made peace with it. Some relationships couldn't survive fundamental differences in values. Some people couldn't understand why you'd choose meaning over money, legacy over comfort. But Emma had discovered something important over the past year. She didn't need everyone to understand. She just needed to understand herself, to know her own values, to live in alignment with what mattered to her. And this mattered. This work, this center, this continuation of her grandfather's legacy, it mattered more than anything she'd ever done. Emma pulled out her laptop and opened a document she'd been working on. It was a grant proposal for expanding the center's programs, adding more recording equipment, hiring staff to help process oral histories, and creating educational programs for schools. The Samuel Hartley Center was just beginning. There was so much more work to do, so many more stories to collect and preserve. She typed for an hour, refining language, strengthening arguments, building the case for why this work deserved support. And as she worked, she felt her grandfather's presence in the room, not in any supernatural way, but in the books he'd chosen, the space he'd created, the values he lived by. He was here. His legacy was here, and Emma was honoring it in the best way she knew how, by continuing his work, by expanding his vision, by making sure the stories he'd protected would be heard and valued and remembered. When she finally closed her laptop and stood up to leave, Emma paused at the door and looked back at the study. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the desk, illuminating the typewriter and the stone paperweight and the guest book full of gratitude. "I did it, Grandpa," she said softly to the empty room. "I figured out what you wanted me to do, and I did it. And I'm going to keep doing it. I promise." The house was silent, but Emma could almost hear his response, could almost see his smile, feel his pride, sense his approval.
She thought she came back to this house to clean it out, to dispose of a lifetime's accumulation of stuff. But she'd actually come back to discover who she was meant to be, to find her purpose, to inherit not just property and possessions, but a calling. Emma turned off the lights and locked the door behind her. Outside, the October night was clear and cool, stars visible above the streetlights. She stood on the front porch for a moment, looking at the sign she'd installed above the door. The Samuel Hartley Center for Personal Histories, preserving individual stories, honoring human experience. It was real. It was here. It was her life's work now. And Emma had never been more certain of anything. She walked to her car, not the beat-up sedan she'd driven here a year ago, but a slightly better used car she'd bought with funds from the estate. She'd moved out of her studio apartment in Richmond and into the small cottage behind the center, the one that had been her grandfather's workshop. It was tiny but sufficient, and being close to the center made sense. This was home now, not just the physical place, but the work itself. The community of people who understood why stories mattered, the daily act of preservation and honor and connection. As Emma drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the center, at the house that held so many stories. The lights were off now, the building dark and peaceful. But tomorrow it would come alive again with visitors, with recordings, with the ongoing work of making sure individual voices weren't lost to time. Emma felt a flutter of curiosity. Did they give a name? Patricia Hartley. Emma's breath caught. Her mother. After 5 years of silence, her mother was here. She found Patricia in the main lobby, standing by the wall of photographs that showed the center's evolution from her grandfather's cluttered house to this professional institution. Her mother looked older than Emma remembered. Her hair had gone mostly gray and lines had deepened around her eyes and mouth. But she stood straight, her posture as perfect as ever, her expression carefully neutral. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Patricia spoke first. "It's impressive, what you've built here." "Thank you." Emma's voice came out cautious, guarded. "I didn't expect to see you." "I didn't expect to come." Patricia turned back to the photographs. "But I've been following the news coverage, the documentary, the articles about the center, and I realized I needed to see it for myself, to understand what you chose over—" She paused. "To understand what you saw that I couldn't." Emma moved to stand beside her mother, both of them looking at a photograph of the center's opening day. "Do you want a tour?" "I'd like that." They walked through the center together, Emma explaining the layout and programming, pointing out significant collections and describing the impact the center had had on the community and beyond. Patricia listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand. When they reached Samuel's preserved study, Patricia stopped in the doorway. Emma watched her mother's face as she took in the room, the books, the typewriter, the desk arranged exactly as it had been when Samuel was alive. A range of emotions crossed Patricia's features: grief, regret, something that might have been anger or might have been pain. "I was angry at him for so long. After my mother died, he disappeared into his work, into his collecting. I felt abandoned,
like he chose his obsession over his own daughter. She touched the doorframe gently. I thought he was running from grief, from life. I thought he'd wasted his last years on a pointless project. And now? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Now, I think maybe I didn't understand what grief looks like, what healing looks like. He wasn't running. He was building something, creating meaning out of loss. And her voice cracked slightly, I was too angry to see it, too hurt to try. Emma felt her throat tighten. Mom, let me finish. Patricia turned to face her daughter. I was wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about your grandfather, wrong about the collection, wrong about what you were doing here. I thought you were throwing your life away, choosing sentiment over practicality. But you weren't throwing anything away. You were finding something, purpose, meaning, a way to make a real difference. I'm not angry at you. I understand why you felt the way you did. I know. That's what makes it worse, somehow. You understood, even when I couldn't. Patricia looked around the study. Can you show me his journal, the one where he documented all his acquisitions? Emma retrieved the journal from its protective case and handed it to her mother. Patricia sat at Samuel's desk, the first time Emma had seen anyone sit there besides herself, and began reading. Emma watched as her mother slowly turned pages, reading her father's careful notes about where he'd found materials and why he'd chosen to preserve them. Tears began to stream down Patricia's face, though she made no sound. She read for nearly an hour, and Emma waited patiently, understanding that this was a conversation between daughter and father, between the living and the dead, facilitated by words written years ago. Finally, Patricia closed the journal and looked up at Emma. He wrote about me, about wishing I could understand, about hoping someday I'd see what he was trying to do, about loving me even though we couldn't connect the way he wanted to. He did love you. That was never in question. But I made him feel like his life's work was worthless, like he'd failed. I can never take that back, can never apologize to him. Emma moved around the desk and put her hand on her mother's shoulder. He knew life was complicated. Knew relationships were complicated. I think he understood even if he wished things had been different. They stood there together in Samuel's study, 3 generations of Hartleys connected across time and loss and misunderstanding and love. Eventually, Patricia stood and embraced Emma, the first real hug they'd shared in years.
I'm proud of you, Patricia whispered, so incredibly proud. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. You're here now. That's what matters. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, Emma showing her mother's collections and sharing stories about the people they'd helped reconnect with their histories. Patricia listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and slowly began to understand what her daughter had built and why it mattered. Before she left, Patricia made a donation to the center, substantial enough to fund a new fellowship program for graduate students studying personal narrative and oral history. In memory of Samuel Hartley, she specified, and in honor of Emma Hartley, who saw what the rest of us couldn't. After her mother left, Emma returned to her office in the cottage behind the center. It was early evening, that golden hour when the light turned everything warm and soft. She opened her laptop to work on the next grant proposal, but found herself distracted, pulled instead to the window that looked out over the center's gardens. They'd planted the gardens 3 years ago, a memorial space where visitors could sit and reflect after spending time with difficult histories. Emma had chosen the location specifically because you could see the old oak tree from here, the one she'd sat under that first overwhelming day when she'd discovered the archive and called her mother from a place of shock and confusion. So much had changed since then. The center had grown, Emma had grown, and the work continued, expanding in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Last year, they'd launched a digital archive that made selected materials available online to researchers worldwide.
The response had been overwhelming. Scholars from 6 continents had accessed the collection, and several had published papers that cited materials they'd discovered in the Hartley archives. Emma's grandfather's work was contributing to academic understanding of 20th century history in ways he'd probably never imagined. But even more meaningful were the personal connections. Just last month, a woman in Australia had found her uncle's letters from the Vietnam War in the digital archive, letters her family had thought were lost in a house fire decades ago. She'd flown to Virginia specifically to see the originals, and Emma had watched her hold her uncle's words with shaking hands, crying tears of gratitude and grief. These moments happen regularly now. The center had become a place of reunion and recognition, where people discovered pieces of their family histories they'd thought were gone forever. Emma had learned that preservation wasn't just about protecting the past. It was about creating possibilities for the future, about ensuring that people who came looking for their stories would find them waiting. Her phone rang. Dr. Catherine Wells calling for their weekly check-in about the center's academic partnerships. "Emma, I have extraordinary news," Catherine said without preamble. "The National Archives wants to partner with us on a major digitization project. They're interested in our methodology for contextualizing personal narratives and oral history and want to apply it to their own collections of letters and diaries from soldiers, immigrants, and civil servants." Emma felt excitement surge through her. "That's incredible. Catherine, that would mean our approach could influence how institutions across the country handle personal histories." "Exactly. Your grandfather's vision of treating historical documents as human stories, rather than just data points, it's catching on. You're changing the field, Emma, not just preserving history, but changing how we think about preservation itself." After the call, Emma sat in the fading light and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. The work that had begun with one man's quiet obsession, that had almost been lost when he died, was now influencing institutions and touching lives around the world. The stories that Samuel Hartley had protected were being heard, valued, remembered. And it was just beginning. Emma pulled up a file on her computer, a letter she'd been drafting to send to graduate programs and history departments around the country. The Samuel Hartley Fellowship Program, funded by her mother's donation, would bring emerging scholars to the center each year to study personal narrative and oral history methodology. These fellows would learn not just archival skills, but the philosophy behind them, the insistence on humanity, the centering of individual experience, the belief that every person's story mattered. They would carry this approach with them to their future careers, spreading the methodology to other institutions, other archives, other communities. Samuel Hartley's legacy wouldn't just be the specific materials he'd preserved. It would be a new generation of archivists and historians trained to see people first, documents second. Emma finalized the fellowship announcement and sent it out. Then she opened a blank document and began writing something she'd been thinking about for months. A book about her grandfather's work and the philosophy behind it. Not an academic text, but something accessible to general readers. Something that would help people understand why preservation mattered, why individual stories were worth protecting, why the work of remembering was sacred work.
When she finally stopped writing, it was dark outside. Emma saved her work and stood up, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. She walked outside into the garden, breathing in the cool evening air, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. This was her life now. This work, this mission, this daily act of preservation and honor. Some people might find it strange to build a life around other people's stories, other people's memories. But Emma had learned that in preserving others' experiences, she was also creating meaning in her own life. The work was reciprocal. The stories she protected gave her purpose, and her dedication gave those stories new life. She thought about Rachel Bergman, who now volunteered at the center twice a month, helping other descendants connect with their family histories. About James Reeves, who had passed away 2 years ago, but whose recorded testimony was used in high school classrooms across the country to help students understand the human cost of nuclear weapons. About the hundreds of other people whose stories lived in the archive, whose voices would continue speaking long after their physical bodies were gone. This was immortality,
Emma realized. Not fame or fortune or monuments, but this, having your story preserved, your voice recorded, your human experience honored and remembered. Her grandfather had understood this, had spent decades creating a kind of immortality for people who might otherwise have been forgotten. And now Emma was doing the same, on an even larger scale. She walked back inside and stopped in the main exhibition hall. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories, new opportunities to connect the past and present. The center would open its doors and welcome people who were searching for meaning, for connection, for proof that their family's experiences mattered. And Emma would be there to help them find what they were looking for. She moved through the building, turning off lights, a nightly ritual she insisted on doing herself. Each room represented a choice she'd made, a vision she'd pursued, a belief she'd held on to even when others questioned her decisions. The oral history studio, where hundreds of people had recorded their testimonies. The research room, where scholars pored over letters and diaries. The education wing, where school groups learned about primary sources and historical methodology. The memorial garden, where visitors processed difficult emotions. All of it had grown from that first moment in her grandfather's basement, from her decision to honor rather than sell, to preserve rather than dispose, to continue rather than end. Emma locked the front door and stood on the porch looking up at the sign that bore her grandfather's name. 5 years had passed since that first day, but the mission remained the same: preserve individual stories, honor human experience, and insist that every life mattered. She would continue this work for the rest of her life, would expand the center, train new archivists, advocate for the importance of personal narrative and understanding history, would make sure that Samuel Hartley's quiet revolution in how we think about preservation and memory would outlive both of them. Because some legacies weren't about wealth or fame. Some legacies were about ideas, about values, about the patient accumulation of stories that testified to the full complexity of human existence. Her grandfather had built that kind of legacy, and Emma was ensuring it would endure. She walked back to her cottage, tired but satisfied, ready for tomorrow's work. Above her, stars filled the sky, unchanged and unchanging, bearing witness to countless human stories across time. In the morning, the center would open again. People would come seeking connection to their past, and Emma would be there to help them find what they were looking for. This was her calling, her purpose, her life's work, and she had never been more grateful for the basement full of boxes that had led her here, or for the grandfather who trusted her to understand what really mattered. Thank you so much for staying with us through Emma's remarkable journey. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring true stories. Leave a comment below telling us what you think Emma should do next with the center. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. The stories would continue, the work would continue, and Emma Hartley, keeper of stories, guardian of voices, would make sure that no one who had lived and loved and suffered and hoped would be forgotten while she had breath in her body and dedication in her heart. Some things were more valuable than money could measure. Some legacies were worth everything. This was both, and Emma would spend her life honoring it.